Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us once again for our Sunday morning video service. Um, as you know, it's been rainy and cold yesterday, and today we hope the sun is out. I just have a couple of things to go over. Our men's group meets on Monday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carla or Pastor Carlos know, and they'll get you hooked up. Next Saturday, the men's group is meeting at the church at 8 o'clock in the morning now for coffee. They thought 7:30 was a little early, and like I shared at church, 6:15 was way early for me. So if you want to be a part of that, come by. You can have a cup of coffee and fellowship with the men. Our ladies group meets on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. We'd love to have you be a part of that. Let myself or Deanne Paradis know. Even if you don't live in the area, that's what the beauty of Zoom. You can still be a part of the Father's house if you'd like to join us. Easter's coming up soon. It's going to be on the 17th of April. So we'd love to invite you to church that Sunday. We're going to have a very special program. Our worship team's already working very hard on it. So we'd love to have you join us that Sunday. It's our Mission Sunday today. So if you would like to give to the missions in Argentina or India, you can give just like your normal tithes and offerings. You go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button. There's a drop-down list for tithes. There's a list for Argentina. There's a list for India. There's also a section for the stage remodel if you want to give to our virtual wall. We're getting ready to get that installed. It's here, but it's not quite paid for. So we'd love to have you give anything that you possibly can towards that. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you'd like Pastor Carl or I to come by and pick it up, or someone else in the church, I'm sure it would not be a problem for that to happen. So again, thank you for all your generosity through this time. I know it's difficult for a lot of people, but things kind of seem to be getting a little more normal, whatever that looks like in our world today. But again, we'd love to we'd like to thank you for your generosity that you have given so far and encourage you to continue to do that. That's all I have to cover today, so I guess we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl.
Well, good morning, Father's House. How are you today? Trust you're having a great week and that you guys have had a great or having a great weekend, even though it did rain on Saturday. But we needed it. Not that we got much. We could probably use another 6 or 7 inches or more, but that probably doesn't look like it's going to happen. Anyway, I'm glad to be back in the Bay Area, kind of. I have to tell you that I love Southern California more than I do the Bay Area because I like the weather and I like the beach. Last week we were there, and so you saw the video last week that we did from there. I have to apologize that the sound was a little echoey, but I didn't bring all of my equipment down there with me. And so it kind of made for a less of a quality video than what we wanted, but it was still functional and we made it through it. So anyway, glad to be back. I'm going to be glad to be back in church on Sunday. We weren't here last Sunday, so I'm excited to see all the people again and just see what's new in their life after 2 weeks. It's amazing because after 2 weeks, you still just, you wonder how everybody's doing when you love and care for them so much. And we do love and care for them, and so we're excited to see our friends and family, church family tomorrow. Anyway, we've been talking a little bit about the virtues. Well, actually, we've been talking a lot about the virtues. We actually started the first of the year talking about the virtues. And we're talking, first of all, and still talking about, we're really talking about the last one in the sequence of the cardinal virtues. The cardinal virtues being that of courage, fortitude, which is the same thing, temperance, self-control, justice, in some cases equity or equality. And then what we're talking about and started talking about last week, I talked on video and Pastor Carlos talked about it in church, was we started to kick off this idea or this notion of prudence. And so we kind of talked about the role of prudence in light of the other virtues. And a better way to maybe describe what prudence is it's the idea of practical wisdom or being wise. This idea of but not just wisdom, not just like this intellectual wisdom that you might have about something. Like somebody that, I don't know, that maybe builds intellectually, engineers some part of a spacecraft, but knows nothing at all about how to apply it in the world of bringing that to an applied science to actually creating a spacecraft, something along those lines. There's an intellectual type of a wisdom, and then there's this idea of prudence, which is almost like the difference between science that's not applied. There's science out there, but it's never applied to anything, and the idea of applied science that actually creates something. An example of that with the math sciences. Geometry, for some extent, would be a science. Math would be a math science. But applied science with geometry might use geometry in figuring out something, or maybe calculus would be a better example of that. Calculus in its raw form is this intellectual science. But in its applied science, you think about calculus by way of calculation, that calculus was used in order for the Americans to send a spaceship to the moon or the Mars lander to Mars. And so there were certain calculations that had to be made. On the one side, there was this science, which was this kind of abstract intellectual science about how you would compute something like that and calculate something like that. And then there's this applied science where you actually utilize it and you see the function of it in the real world, the effect of it in a cause and effect relationship in our material real world by what we just talked about. Well, practical wisdom is kind of like that. There's this wisdom that is this high wisdom. And yet there's this part where that wisdom's got to be applied if it's going to make any really significant mark on a person's life or benefit other people on behalf of us because of the wisdom that we have. So it's like an applied wisdom that we use for our own lives and which we can then convey to others for their lives. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So we talked about prudence being that kind of a practical wisdom. We also talked about it last week about almost being the driver, like you being the driver of a car. All the other virtues are a car, and it's practical wisdom or prudence that knows what to employ, when to employ courage, when to employ justice, when to employ self-control, or generosity, or friendship, all of those different virtues that are out there. And it's like this one is that common connection between all the virtues which makes them function to this idea of prudence or practical wisdom. And so that's kind of just, when we understand what prudence is in a sense, that's kind of what it is in a nutshell. Now I talked about the fact that we can talk about prudence for months and never really discover the depths of it, just like when we talked about all the other virtues and the virtues that we'll continue to talk about. But I kind of wanted to break this down in a couple of different things today. So the first thing I want to break down is the idea of that prudence is, in one respect, it's the wisdom of the sage. And I kind of picked that because it's kind of synonymous in one respect, because we're talking really here about Christian wisdom. We're not talking about just our prudence. We're not talking about worldly prudence, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But anyway, it's the idea of a sage. So in the Old Testament time of the Hebrews, and it's probably even true to some extent today within Judaism, that there's really kind of three branches of teachers that are out there. There's the prophets, and the prophets in the Old Testament, where those that they kind of dealt not with individuals, but they dealt with kind of national things, right? It would be either the nation of Israel, or when Judah and Israel were divided, dealing with them, but also dealing with others like Edom and some other ones, dealing on a national level, these prophetic words that we kind of hear by the major and the minor prophets. But the second group that we have which was called the priests, or the teaching priests, and they were pretty much given to the liturgical. They were given to the Levitical laws on how to present a sacrifice, the religious system kind of to some extent. And then there was a third group, which was actually known as the sages, or they were the wise men. Some of the wise men that we would pick up in the Old Testament would be Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Moses would be one of those. And also Daniel, and there's many others. Some of the women that we would pick up would be Abigail. Deborah would be another one that would be a wise woman. And in the New Testament, we would, of course, include Mary in that, along with some other women. But the idea with that is that that's that sage, or it's that wise woman, or that wise man that just seems to bring that timely advice when it's needed. Now, the sage was, or the prudent person, was the one in Old Testament time that would sit at the gates of the city when it talks about that in the Old Testament. It talks about that really in the book of Proverbs. And so some of the writings that you would associate with the sage or with prudence would be Job, Psalms to some extent, Proverbs. You would pick up Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. In the New Testament, probably the counterpart in the New Testament when we talk about wisdom and this idea of wisdom and practical wisdom and prudence for the most part would be the book of James, which I know sometimes shakes us up because it's such straightforward advice for living that has caused a lot of people much distress as far as how to interpret what James writes with what Paul writes. Needless to say, we're talking about that kind of practical wisdom, the wisdom of a sage, a wise woman, of a wise man. So I thought that today what we would talk about is I wanted to introduce a couple of verses to talk about, just to kind of set the stage for it. Last week we talked about it when we talked about Jesus, when he was discussing the wise man or the prudent man who built his house on a solid stone foundation, and the foolish man who built his house on the sand. Now remember, a couple of weeks ago we talked about the notion of justice, and we talked about that at the very foundation of the throne of God is righteousness and justice. So they're foundation stones. They're things that God even builds his throne on. And if that's the case, shouldn't they be things that we build our life on as well? So concerning this idea of wisdom, I want to start off, first of all, with that great passage in the book of Proverbs, starting in Proverbs chapter 1. Now, I've talked about this over and over again with you as far as the congregation goes, about what I see the value of Proverbs, the first 9 chapters in Proverbs. It's where wisdom is personified as a woman, and I love it. She's personified as a mother, sometimes maybe as a sister, but also as a lover. And so it's the idea of mother wisdom, sister wisdom, and also wisdom as your beloved, or the thing that you desire and love, and really should love the most. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about this, about what the purpose of why it was that Solomon wrote this book. And it's the first 8 chapters, but it speaks of some profound things when we're talking about wisdom and prudence. It says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And this purpose was to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity. Verse 4 is important. To give prudence to the naive or the fool, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase his learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, to the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So there's this notion and this idea in this book, in Proverbs, that the purpose that he's writing that book is to instruct in wisdom. And you notice that it talked in there about this idea of prudence, or about the prudent, and also about the young. To teach prudence to the naive, or to teach prudence to the foolish, or to the simpleton, is kind of the way that it reads. So what's interesting is that on your study of prudence, if you were to go study it, the prudent man or prudence, you find more if you were to use the word prudent in a commentary or a concordance, but prudence and prudent, well, they're basically the same thing. But the idea there is that you'll always find a couple of things there. You'll always, well, the biggest thing is you'll always find there's this juxtaposition between the prudent man and the foolish, the prudent woman and the foolish woman, although prudent in both of those instances. So it's the idea of, well, the prudent does this, but the foolish does this. And it's the idea of what Solomon's trying to tease forward there is the preeminence of prudence over that of being a fool. And so these wise men that I talked about at the city, they were there in some ways to teach the people how to live a life that would be a life that was in line with the virtues. We really call it virtue ethics or virtue morality to some extent. And so when we're talking about all these virtues, we're talking about how it is to live our life. Now, this becomes important. When we're talking about all the virtues, and we're talking about the virtue of prudence, this is a very, very important point. There's always an end goal or an end reality to what we're talking about. So prudence is always thinking about the future. It's always thinking about a final end that it has in mind. Now, I could go into a lot of depth into that, but I don't want to talk a lot about that aspect of it. But our human mind, in our thinking, we always work for an end. We're always working towards a goal or an end in mind. Let me give an example of that. If a person decides and they make up they reason that they want a degree. Let's say they want a degree in business administration. They just finished high school. Well, then what they would do is, using the virtue of prudence, is they would plan out what school they're going to go to, or what schools to apply to, what schools would accept them, and which one they choose to go to, how they're going to finance it, and the other situations, with the goal in mind of finishing that degree in 4 or 5 years. So they've employed prudence to be able to do that. Now that would be an earthly prudence to some extent. When we're talking about prudence from the Christian perspective, we're talking about not just incorporating the idea of that type of a temporal or of a secular type of prudence, because those things are good when the end is good. But in the Christian experience, it's more than that, because the virtue of prudence just isn't for the good in this temporal life, but it's to pursue good in our moral life and in our life with God, in our life with other people. Now, I think we're going to talk a lot more about this when we talk about the virtues of faith, hope, and love. But the idea is that the virtues for a Christian are bigger than they are for a non-Christian. They have a different dimension to them because we're employing God into them and all that God has to say about courage or temperance, and in this case, prudence, prudent living. So what we don't realize is that Jesus talked a lot about prudence, and yet I think it's something that we probably don't understand well in what it is that he's written or was written about him or that he said, any more than I think we understood. And we found this to be true in our study of justice when we started looking at what Jesus had to say about justice and how valuable that was to Jesus. Remember when we talked about that when he was talking with the scribes and Pharisees, he said, woe to you, because you tithe on mint and dill and you neglect the weightier things of mercy, of justice and of mercy and of faithfulness. And so there's this idea and this notion when we talk about those things that Jesus puts a great emphasis on these things. As evangelicals, there's something that we miss. There's something that we sometimes just don't grasp or get a hold of. So I want to tell you a little story read a little story here out of the life of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus that's found in Luke, and we're gonna pick it up on in Luke chapter 16, and I want to tell you that I'm going to read this small parable, and this parable is probably the most misunderstood parable in all of Scripture. As a matter of fact, when we read it, and I can remember reading it for a long time and saying, I don't get it. I don't understand what it is that Jesus is saying, because he's using a very negative situation to try to convey a spiritual, a religious and a holy teaching. And so when you're reading it, you're very confused by what it is that Jesus is saying. And we'll go over it and I'll show you. In verse 16 of Luke chapter 1, it says, now he was saying to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and he said to him, what is it that I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be my manager. The manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig. I am too ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. So he summoned each one of his master's debtors, and he began saying to them first, how much do you owe my master? And he said to him, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill and sit down and quickly write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to them, take your bill and write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. Now get what Jesus says. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. So when you read that, you're kind of going, what in the world is going on here? I mean, it's like, I don't get it. So let me explain, because this parable has everything to do with prudence. Now, first of all, I want to say that whenever we're talking about the virtues, and especially when we're talking about the idea of common sense, practical wisdom, that can be used in two ways. It can be used in a negative way, and it can be used in a positive way. The only way that a Christian, from the Christian perspective, that we ought to use any wisdom that we have is to further that which is right and that which is good. But I'll give you an example of that. So in my business dealings, when I worked for corporations, which we did home development, single family, we did some detached, and we did some high rise. And so I was very involved in the upper management with these projects when we were designing them, buying the land for them, and such, and financing them. Well, people that were very smart with finances had this financial wisdom that they would bring to the table. Now, with that financial wisdom, they could do one of two things with that. They could take that financial wisdom and they could find a way to twist things and to turn things to where it became to their benefit and to the hurt of maybe their other business partners, or to the hurt of the people they're buying the land from, or the contractors that are doing the work. In that case, they used their shrewd wisdom in a negative way. They used their shrewd wisdom for their own gain, and in that case, it became unjust because they didn't seek an equity between other people. That's an example of how practical wisdom can be misused. Now, what we have in this case of this parable is exactly that. He's saying that this manager knew that he was in a predicament where he was going to lose his job because he was squandering his master's possession. And so his master came and said, I want you to square up the accounts. You've got kind of one of those kind of things like, okay, you've got 2 weeks until you're no longer going to be employed. And you're going to have to download the information so that we can pick up and we can do business. And it will be seamless when I bring another manager in. This manager kind of looks and says, well, gosh, I can't go out and dig ditches. And I'm really too ashamed to just beg people to live in their home. So what I'll do is I'll go to those people that owe my boss, that owe my master this money, and I'll cut a deal with them. I'll be friends to them, and I'll be shrewd so that when somebody owes 100 measures of something, I'll reduce it by 50%. And then when I lose my job, this man will remember what I did for him, and he'll take me into his home, and I'll be okay. So he does that with a bunch of different clients. And he did that, remember what we talked about an end in mind. Like we talked about graduating from college. The end in mind was he knew that the end wouldn't be well if he didn't do that. So he used practical wisdom. He used his shrewd mentality for his own gain to get what it is that he needed. Now, when you hear that and you think about that, and when Jesus shows that this man is commended by the master, it makes you scratch your head and wonder, what is it that Jesus is trying to convey in this parable? Well, this is what Jesus is conveying. As much as a developer that may not be as ethical as he ought to be might skew numbers and skew resources and different things and try to always work an angle for his benefit, in that he's showing worldly prudence to some extent. Now, that's devoid of the godly virtue of prudence, which is different than that. But what Jesus is saying is they're more shrewd in doing what's wrong. This unhealthy or unholy manager is more prudent in doing what is wrong than people and the sons of light are of doing what is right. That becomes very important, because what Jesus is talking about here, he's talking about prudence that can be misused, which would really not be a virtue at all. It would be the opposite of that. It would be considered a vice. But what he's saying is that he's somewhat embarrassed by the fact, or he's somewhat discouraged by the fact, that the religious folk of his own day, and maybe his own disciples, and maybe he's even speaking to us today, that we don't have a value for prudence or wisdom or practical wisdom in order to advance the things that God wants us to advance a society and a group of people in a church, people in our family, and our friends, to find the good ending that God has for them and to pursue that by the virtue of prudence rather than the vice of imprudence. So Jesus is commending them on the fact that they understood better the power of that than a Christian should, or at that time the Jews should. So the question then becomes for us, play on this for us as far as understanding this parable is that God wants us to be people of practical wisdom, of being able to reason well about life and what we should and what we shouldn't do. Prudence is always based in reason. It's always based in being reasonable. But it's only a Christian virtue, and really a virtue to any extent. It's only a Christian virtue. And it's only really a virtue when its good is a real good, a true good. When it promotes others by the way of justice. When it encourages within us this reasoning ability to live a life of self-control in our mind, in our words, and in our actions. In all of this is what virtue is. What Jesus was showing in his parable, or in this parable, was what virtue was not Christian virtue. And so there's a difference, and he's just showing this is what is not Christian virtue. But he's calling us to Christian virtue. I want to invite you to look through your Bible, to get a good concordance, and you can get them online at Bible Hub or other Bible websites. Get a concordance and look up the word prudence, prudent. Get up, look, and get those words and look them up, and look at all the texts and the passages that talk about the way that our speech should be it should always employ prudence, and our actions should, and how we present ourselves even before God in prudence. To begin to see the value of what He's called us to do and to be. Well, God bless you. I hope you'll think more of this subject, and hopefully we'll talk about it more next week as we talk about prudence before we move into what would be called the infused virtues, or the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. Have a great rest of the week.